Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Arena. So, this week we're going to be taking a look at a blue-white Temporal Friends list. So, this is essentially blue-white control / super friends that I wanted to find a place for Karn's Temporal Sundering, essentially. Which is essentially 4 and 2 blue, legendary sorcery, which means you can only cast it if you have a legendary creature or planeswalker in play. Hence the Super Friends side of the deck. It says target player takes an extra turn after this one, return up to one target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then exile it. So with Karn's Temporal Sundering in this deck, we can take up to 3 turns essentially in a row, while also bouncing permanents as well. So if our opponent's got something really deadly, we can get rid of that right away. So the idea is that we take extra turns with planeswalkers like Teferi, a hero of Dominaria. We've also got Karn in here as well, Scion of Urza, and Gideon of the Trials. And ideally, we also want Oath of Teferi on the board. Oath of Teferi is the most busted oath that has ever existed. 3, a blue, and a white for a legendary enchantment. When Oath of Teferi enters the battlefield, exile another target permanent you control. Return it to the battlefield under its control at the beginning of the next end step. So what we can do, actually, is a nice little combo. Essentially, what you want to do most of the time is just flicker a land or something like that. But you can actually, if you flipped over the Treasure Cove and used all of the treasures, you can target Treasure Cove and you get the treasure map back on your end step. So you can start scrying and then generate those treasures again. It's very nice. You could technically do that with Search for Azcanta if you wanted to as well, but most of the time you kind of want Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin, over anything else. So let's go start at the beginning of the deck, shall we? We've got 3 copies of Gideon's Reproach. Now, the reason I'm running this over Seal Away, and there's 2 builds that you can actually use for this. The reason why I'm running this is because of Urza's Ruinous Blast. So Urza's Ruinous Blast is a 4 and a white legendary sorcery. It says exile all non-land permanents that aren't legendary. So this is essentially a 5-mana board wipe. We can Karn on 4, and then we can wipe on 5 and clear our opponent's board. Mostly clear, half the time. It does have the little downside of not hitting legendary permanents, which is where we actually use the rest of our counters and our removal to kind of even that out a little bit. Because until we get Fumigate in the format, because it's in Kaladesh? Yeah, Kaladesh. Until we get Fumigate, this is kind of the best way to wipe the board, other than Settle the Wreckage, but people play around this quite a lot, which is why we have this secondary thing. And also Gideon's Reproach as well, to punish people playing around Settle the Wreckage. But essentially we can't use Ixalan's Bindings, Cast Outs, and Seal Aways, because if we use the Blast, we give them everything that we've exiled underneath them. So I'm trying out Urza's Ruinous Blast. So far it's been quite fun. If your opponent Ixalan's Bindings your Planeswalkers, for example, then you get to Ruinous Blast away all of the exile, and you might even, on top of that 5 mana to wipe their board clear, might even get 2 or 3 Planeswalkers back for your troubles, which you can then tick up, and then Oath of Teferi does fun stuff. But yeah, we're going for the non-permanent based exile and removal approach here. I'm not sure if it is the best way. I'm leaning towards it not being, but it's certainly the most fun way. So Gideon's Reproach is 2 and a white for an instant speed. It deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. The only thing that I don't like about this card is when you're playing against dinos and they've got enraged things, because it deals damage to them. Other than that, though, this is a solid little removal card. Most of the time your opponent's creatures are going to be attacking in anyway, and anything that's not attacking in probably isn't worth reproaching. So there is that. Next, to deal with Red Deck Wins. Also, yes, very good for Red Deck Wins. Takes care of pretty much every non-Hazaret creature in the entire deck, so very good. Same goes for Essence Scatter. We want to be on the play for Essence Scatter, but if we do that, 1 and a blue for an instant speed, counter target creature spell. Takes care of a hell of a lot of stuff. Also really good for Scarab God matchups. This deck is really good against Scarab Gods, because our opponent can't steal any of our creatures, because we don't have any. There are no creatures in this list. Other than maybe if you count the soldiers off of Memorial to Glory, but that's about it. Just testing this card out, really. It doesn't really do a great deal other than being tap land, but it's never done me any harm either, so it means it can only help, right? But there you go. After that, we've got 2 copies of Negate, basically for the control mirror, and a few other things as well. Like, vampires do use Radiant Destiny and things like that, so to be able to Radiant Destiny counter on 3 is pretty good, so negates are pretty sweet. Got 1 copy of Search for Azcanta. I'm leaning towards the treasure maps for most of our card advantage. As I mentioned, we do have like a lot of flicker on the treasure maps, so we can reuse the card draw here, so only running 1 search, but it is pretty sweet. He also does synergize quite well with Teferi as well, does Azcanta the Sunken Room, but we'll get to that in a moment. Say 1 and a blue for a legendary enchantment, which means it doesn't go away with Urza's Ruinous Blast. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get to look at the top card of your library. You may put it into your graveyard, and if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you flip it to Azcanta the Sunken Ruin, which is card advantage on a stick. Adds blue, or you can pay 2 and a blue and tap it to look at the top 4 cards of your library, and you may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them, put into your hand. Basically, counter spells and removal. The reason why it synergizes quite well with Teferi when you're in here is because he actually gets to untap lands for his +1. So you can use Search for Azcanta, you can untap it on your end step, and then you can maybe use it again depending on the amount of mana that you've got. So if you don't have to use that counter, then you can fill up your hand a little bit more. This deck does a lot of drawing. I'm thinking of maybe putting 1 Commit to Memory in for that reason, but I've never got to the point where I've actually milled myself. I think the closest I've ever got to getting to a mill is 15 cards left in my deck before I won. So it does quite well. Anyway, Treasure Map is a 2-mana artifact that says pay 1 and tap it to scry 1. Put a landmark counter on Treasure Map, then if there are 3 or more landmark counters on it, remove those counters, transform it, create 3 treasure tokens, which all can add mana, and then you can have Treasure Cove, which can sack treasures to draw cards as well. So he opens you up essentially to 3 scries and then 3 draws, then you can flicker it back, get the treasures back, start scrying, start drawing, that kind of thing. Really, really solid stuff. Do very much enjoy Treasure Map. So, Gideon of the Trials, I'm sure most of you know this guy by now. 1 and 2 white for a 3 loyalty planeswalker. The +1 allows you to essentially fog a creature until next turn, prevent all damage that target permanent will deal. So you can actually target Ramunap Ruins and things like that. You can target non-creature stuff, but most of the time what you want to be doing is ticking up on the biggest creature that they have available at the time. And Gideon's essentially here to protect the rest of the planeswalkers while they do their absolutely broken stuff. So you can tick up, fog stuff. For 0, you can actually turn him into a 4/4 beater as well. He is an alternative win condition. I say alternative win condition. Karn's the minus is one of the win conditions, and Teferi's ultimate also wins you on the spot, and it's not hard to do either of them, so they're not out of the question as far as win conditions are concerned. But if neither of those are going to work, then Gideon's 0 to turn him into a 4/4 with Indestructible, that is still a planeswalker. You prevent all damage that's dealt to him as well, so he's very difficult to block because you're probably going to lose whatever blocks him. And 4 damage per turn is pretty disgusting. If you have Oath of Teferi down on the board, you get to activate Planeswalker's abilities twice each turn. So if we played Gideon, we could 0 him to get his emblem, which says that we are not allowed to lose the game as long as we have a Gideon in play. And then we can get in with him as a creature or tick up to Fog to protect him. So yeah, with Oath of Teferi, being able to tick up on 2 creatures as well is usually enough for you to not be able to get hurt at all, and then anything that does come through either gets Gideon's reproached, settled, or then board wiped later down the line. 3 copies of Supreme Will for 2 and a blue, instant speed. So this is one of our conditional counters, but it also counts as fixing as well to make sure that we hit all of the stuff. Because we do it is sort of a combo control deck in a way. The deck doesn't really win very well until Oath of Teferi's down, and then it's just not even a competition at that point. So Supreme Will allows us to find our Planeswalkers, find our counter spells, find our board wipes, anything of that sort, and if any of that's not useful, then he's a counter spell that counters unless our controller plays 3. So can become less useful depending on the matchup. If your opponent's running a lot of cheap creatures and then they get flooded, Supreme Will loses all of its value, but at least on the upside, it can actually just start searching for better counterspells. Speaking of, Wizard's Retort is our main counterspell in the deck. So for 1 and 2 blue, instant speed, you only really need to know about the counter target spell. What I will say is if you're on a budget and you want to replace this, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to not run cancels. I'm only running Wizard's Retorts because I have them and they're new and I like the art. but you could just run cancel and you'd be completely fine. Cancel is this one right here, or maybe this one if you've got it. There's also another blue raid one as well that does exactly the same kind of thing. You might want to consider running that, I suppose. Anyway, 4 copies of Settle the Wreckage. Kind of important in this deck. The board wipes are very key to making sure that your planeswalkers stay alive. Because as much as your opponent wants to play around Settle the Wreckage, when you've got planeswalkers on the field, they kind of have to attack them. So they have to attack them for enough to kill them most of the time. So Settle the Wreckage is 2 and a white for an instant speed that exiles all attacking creatures target player controls. That player may search his or her library for that many basic land cards, put those onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle their library. So, doesn't do you a great deal of good having that much mana when you've got no board presence to threaten my planeswalkers. When Kaladesh comes out, I would suggest going for maybe 5 board wipes in this deck. I would go 3 Fumigates, 2 Settle the Wreckages, I think, would be my balance for that. Settles in the early game to deal with aggro strategies, Fumigates later down the line for just a clean sweep, essentially. Settle can be played around, which is the problem with it. If your opponent only swings in with enough to kill you and leaves everything behind, then you need another board wipe, which is not what a board wipe really wants to be at the end of the day. But often you can actually get them with a Settle the Wreckage. I love a good got 'em with it, but wiping their entire board for 4 mana at instant speed is pretty sweet. So, second planeswalker of the deck, we've got a 4 mana Karn, Scion of Urza. Comes in with a big loyalty booty at 5 and ticks up straight into 6, which is really important because it actually plays around Hour of Devastation, which none of the other planeswalkers can actually do. They all tick up into exactly 5, and Hour of Devastation deals 5 damage to all creatures and planeswalkers. Karn's the only one who survives that, and that's kind of important because there are a few occasions where we want to follow up with an Urza's Ruinous Blast, or even a Karn's Temporal Mastery, and having a planeswalker in play is the best way to do that, because you can't actually cast these without a planeswalker in the field, which is why we have quite a fair few of them. I think we've got the right balance of them. You might want to tick around a little bit, but I did just do a stream yesterday, depending on when this video goes up, where we went 6 and 3 with this deck, so it does quite well. I think we only missed on the last game because we got a bit mana flooded and our opponent was drawing like a beast. So we definitely had the opportunity to go 7 and 2, but we didn't quite get there. It's a very solid deck, is what I'm getting at anyway. The +1, anyway, reveals the top 2 cards of your library. An opponent chooses one of them, put that card into your hand and exile the other with a silver counter on it. So the upside, the uptick on this isn't actually particularly good all of the time. If you hit a land and an important card, they're always going to give you the land. But that does mean in a control deck, you're always hitting your land drops after 4, though. So in that sense, it's also very good. I do enjoy a Karn on 4 if I'm missing my land drop for the 5. Because they always give you the land to make sure that you can tick up into a Ruinous Blast or something like that. They actually do themselves more harm than good sometimes by giving you the land instead of the important card. But yeah, if he does actually skip off the important card, the -1 can allow us to get it back. -1, put a card you own with a silver counter on it from exile into your hand. Very important wording in this, actually, because unlike most Planeswalker abilities, Karn doesn't actually care about that specific Karn exiling that card. It only cares about a card in exile with a silver counter on it. So if you tick up several thousand times with a Karn and lose him, then you can just play another Karn and you can minus and get any of those cards with a silver counter on it. It's just straight up card advantage, essentially. You're drawing 2 cards a turn with Karn. It's just you don't have access to one of them at some point. However, if you Oath of Teferi, you can uptick Karn, look at those 2 cards. If you like both of them, then you can downtick him immediately and go get that card. Really powerful stuff. The minus is one of the ways that we win with this deck as well. It's also a reason why I run the treasure maps in this deck. The -2 creates a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. So they essentially come out as 1/1s on their baseline. However, if you've got treasure map in play, then you might have up to 3 treasure artifact tokens. So Karn can actually minus maybe some 4/4s out on these -2, which is a really good way of protecting himself. It should be noted that he can do all of his abilities upon being played, and he can even double tick down with the Oath of Teferi and still survive it as well. He goes to 1 and you'll have 2/2/2s at a bare minimum, which is pretty sweet. I think we've mostly talked about everything now. We've got Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, actually. 3, a blue and a white for a 4 mana, 4 loyalty planeswalker. This is our main win condition. This guy is broken. I think he's like $40 in paper right now. He's stupidly good. So, Legendary Planeswalker, Teferi. Goes from 4 loyalty up to 5 with the uptick as well. You get to draw a card, and then at the beginning of the next end step, untap 2 lands. So he synergizes quite well with our flip lands, our treasure maps, our search for Ascanters, all that kind of thing. He can also make himself an extra cheap as well. If you think about it, you're cutting 2 lands off of his mana cost as well. So he actually is a 3 loyalty planeswalker who ends his turn on 5 loyalty, which is stupid. Really stupid. If you got the Oath of Teferi in play as well, he ends up being a 1 mana planeswalker if you uptick twice. The -3 allows you to put target non-land permanent into its owner's library, 3rd from the top, so we can actually counter our opponent's Teferi with this as well. We can hit absolutely anything with it. So if our opponent has Ixalan's Binding to Planeswalker, we can minus Teferi to get back that Planeswalker. If we've got an Oath, then we can uptick twice with that released Planeswalker, and then tick up with Teferi again. He's so stupidly broken. I don't know why they printed him. He's so good. I think he's like really good though with Oath of Teferi. I think maybe he's pretty good on his own, but when you combine him with his Oath, good God. The -8, which is very much not difficult to get to. 3 turns of having him out and you can ultimate and keep him alive, essentially. If you're upticking twice a turn, from 4 to 6, 6 to 8, and then the next turn you go to 9, down 8, leave him on 1, and you get, whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent an opponent controls. So you get to exile all of their lands, all of their permanents, and essentially every single turn they lose something important, and you get to choose what it is. So your opponent can basically never win from that ultimate unless you were really in a horrible spot, which hopefully you weren't because you've just taken 3 turns in a row with Karn's Temporal Sundering. Who knows? But yeah, I'm hoping in the deck matches at least that we get to show off Karn's Temporal Sundering, because this, in my play testing, has actually earned its slot in this deck. Having 3 turns in a row with 3 different planeswalkers who can tick up and down twice a turn is a lot of value. And honestly, I think Karn's Temporal Sundering, you can be quite far behind, and you can play your Teferis and stuff like that. You can start taking extra turns, and you can really flip the tables, because you can bounce 2 important permanents that they've got to own, and you can tick up several times, make extra land drops, just completely refill your hand as well. So I think this is actually a really fun little card. I wanted to find a really good slot for him in some sort of deck, and I think this is the one for him. So onto the mana base. It's pretty self-explanatory for the most part. We got 1 Memorial to Glory because I wanted to test it out. It's a little bit of extra beats. Can also protect our planeswalkers as well. So it's a tapped mono white land. You can pay 4 and tap it to sacrifice it and put 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the board. Basically chump blockers, but maybe as well also extra beats to go in there with Gideon, or even our construct tokens from Karn. Anything like that to just extra beat down our opponent. When they've got nothing left on board because you've just been blasting them, things like that, then they can be quite clear to just straight up swing on through. We've got 6 planes, an Ibnu Rivulet to essentially catch the Approach of the Second Sun lists. Should be noted with Approach, if we can keep a Gideon in play with his emblem, we can't actually lose to Approach, so we have to just counter cast outs and Ixalan's Bindings that target Gideon. But if they've just put their Approach of the Second Sun into their deck, then we can strategically sacrifice a desert to put the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, essentially removing the Approach of the Second Sun from their deck. Also, combos quite well with Teferi's Minus as well. Turns Teferi's Minus into a removal spell, so you put it 3rd from the top, and then you mill 4 with Ibnu Rivulet, essentially removing the card for good. So if it's something that you really can't deal with, that Teferi can target, then you can do it that way as well. 7 islands. We've got a Memorial to Genius. comes into play tapped. However, this is a nice little bit of card draw. I do like this card. I'm considering maybe playing an extra one as well. 4 and a blue to tap it, to sacrifice it, to draw 2 cards. So nice card advantage. We've got 4 copies of Glacial Fortress. Nice check lands. Comes into play tapped unless you control a plains or an island. You can swap these out for... You're not going to show up for me? Why are you not showing up for me? Oh, because I got cancelled. You can swap these out for the tap lands if you want. It will slow your deck down a little bit, but... So you can have irrigated farmlands if you've got extra ones of them. They're perfectly fine. Meandering Rivers is the one that I was looking for. These are just nice tap lands. You do really like the Glacial Fortresses coming into play untapped. The same goes for the irrigated farmlands as well. If you don't have any, just run Meandering Rivers. But the cycle on these is very nice. Going farmland turn 1 as well allows you to Glacial Fortress on turn 2 untapped, and then you can have 2 dual lands untapped on turn 2. Very nice. Otherwise, it helps with mana flooding as well. You can cycle these for 2 mana to redraw. 1 Arch of Araska. I actually don't like this card, surprisingly. It has Ascend, which essentially means if you've got 10 or more permanents, then you get the City's Blessing, and the City's Blessing essentially allows us to pay 5, tap it, and draw a card. Very expensive card draw. I don't think it's actually necessary, to be perfectly honest. I've never really used this in my matchups, so I'm considering cutting it. But for now, if you've got like no Planeswalkers in play or any way of drawing cards, this is repeatable card draw, so it's nice on paper. I just don't know if it's necessarily the card that you want. It's also a target for Field of Ruins as well if they really want to, which could later down the line actually save you a game if maybe you want to keep your Scavenger Grounds around. Speaking of, it's a colourless land. You pay 2, tap it to sacrifice a desert, and you exile all cards from all graveyards. So in matchups that I've seen, it's really good against Scarab Gods because you essentially get rid of all of their targets. Any Embalm shenanigans, Drake decks as well that revolve around instants and sorceries. You can exile the entire board and turn them into 0/4s. There's a lot of uses for Scavenger Grounds, which is why I'm running 1 copy of it. We've got a lot of utility lands essentially in the deck to make sure that we can catch all of the matchups. While we don't have very good matchups in some cases, I think we've got at least a little bit of tech for a fair few of them. Maybe even run more Ipinu Rivulets if you've got them over the islands, but you will be paying life for your lands, which is not ideal because we don't have any life gain in the deck, so got to keep that in mind. Finally, Field of Ruin as well is our way of dealing with legendary flip lands and things like that. Search for Ascanter, Treasure Map, that kind of thing. Maybe even a dual land as well if we want to cut them off of double colours or something like that. You can pay 2, sacrifice it, and destroy a non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield, then shuffles their library. So in addition to the land destruction side of Field of Ruin, it's also good against Approach as well. You can force them to shuffle the Approach of the Second Sun back into their deck, so if they're close to drawing it, then you wipe out a land and they're forced to shuffle their deck, so you can potentially kill a little bit of time doing it that way, which allows you to potentially get your ultimate and start exiling lands, which means they can no longer cast their Approach of the Second Suns. That's the deck anyway, guys. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, like, subscribe, maybe even share the deck list if you do enjoy the look of it as well. Every little bit of support helps the channel out a great deal. If you want to check out the matches, there should be a link at the end of the video as well on the end card. And I will see you guys on the battlefield. Hurrah!